There is a moment in this film when sunrise spills across a city that doesn't quite know whether to bow to its past or sprint into its future, when the camera glides over tin roofs glossed with dew and glass towers tinted with pride, when the first motorbikes stitch their way through a tapestry of alleys and boulevards and a single notification on a smartphone echoes like a gong across a temple courtyard, and in that very second everything changes, because Mulai hari ini yang Terkaya is a promise, a threat, and a dare wrapped in one audacious sentence that lands with the intoxicating weight of a life suddenly heavier with possibility. And as we're ushered into this story, the film asks us a question most movies skirt and most people daydream about. If, in the span of one heartbeat, fortune found you, would you become freer or more trapped by the glitter? Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Released in 2025 and arriving with the swagger of a headline you can't ignore, this film sits at the crossroad of Indonesia's buzzing cinema resurgence and the global hunger for stories about class, ambition, and the secret anatomy of modern wealth. And even though the title flashes like a joke you could write on the back of a minibus, there's a seriousness in its bones, a quiet ache that lingers in how it is shot, how the faces breathe, how the city hums as if each high-rise has its own heartbeat, because the filmmakers aren't racing to moralize, they are simmering, letting the heat of Jakarta's morning traffic and monsoon nights loosen the truth from the people who live inside this fairy tale gone feral. Our story centers on Olya, 26, deadpan hilarious when she needs to be and gentle in all the places she thinks no one is watching, a call center agent whose voice is trained to apologize on cue, who lives in a narrow cos where walls are thin and hopes are louder than complaints, who keeps a plastic jar for coins labeled moving out and another jar, unlabeled, full of folded notes with prayers written in a neat hand, whose father drives an anchored and returns home each night with a cough he tries to laugh away, and whose older brother, D, carries both resentment and responsibility like two uneven buckets. And on a Tuesday that began with spilled coffee, best friend Dima switching shifts so she can visit her mother at the clinic, and a sudden rain that tastes like metal, Olya's phone glows with a balanced figure that looks like a glitch and a text from a bank liaison who doesn't speak in exclamation points but in invitations to private rooms, and what begins as a laugh, some bug, surely, some cruel mirage, turns into a rapid, breathless tour through counters and signatures and the uncanny hush of an air-conditioned office where wealth is made not noisy by coins but invisible by digits. The film plays this initial surge like a dream you can half control. The camera floats an inch above the floor as Olya tries to keep herself grounded, cutting to her worn sandals stepping onto marble, intercut with memories of the market where she squeezes tomatoes just right and bargains for coriander with a vendor who calls her knack, intercut with the flicker of treadmill videos playing on a cracked phone screen of influencers whose skin glows like they were born beside a ring light, intercut with night buses and a call center floor where rows of people speak into headsets under a fluorescent sky, and against this collage, the story plants its seed. The money is not a mistake, it is the sudden effect of a debt long owed to a family branch Olya never met, a legal instrument triggered by a sequence of events that sound more myth than spreadsheet, and if she signs now, she will have access not just to an account but to a world built around that account, rules that will now bend for her like tall grass for wind. Now, I won't spoil the lawyers and labyrinths, the conference rooms where gratitude and greed dress in the same suit, but the film doesn't paint wealth as a simple gift, it paints it as a storm front, and it's how Olya winds her hair into a bun, takes a breath, and walks into the storm that sets the pulse of the entire narrative. The first act is a dizzying festival of firsts, the first time Olya tips so much at a warung that the owner laughs and insists on paying her back with extra bowls of soup and a hug, the first time she wears a dress the color of turmeric silk that changes how strangers address her, the first time she realizes that doors she didn't know existed have been waiting for her like elevators in buildings with no lobby, and to the film's credit it lets these moments nudge the edges of comedy without turning her into a gag, because the camera loves her not for what she now can buy but for how her brow furrows when she is deciding whether to buy, how she watches other people watching her and tries to stay small, a shadow inside the shimmer. Dimas, her closest friend, is the emotional barometer we all need in a story like this, a man who jokes every time he's afraid and who, in one of the film's cleanest, most telling scenes, stands beside her on a pedestrian bridge at night and asks in a tone that is almost a whisper, "Are you still you?" The film excels in these pauses, silences smoked with street lamp gold, the camera leaning into shoulders, an intimacy that keeps us from treating Olya as a symbol and instead keeps us tethered to her as a person with muscle memory and favorite songs and a habit of stroking the bridge of her nose when she wants to stand her ground without starting a fight. Siska is the influencer who oozes into the second act as temptation disguised as friendship, her smile a neon sign and her advice a cocktail of kindness and convenience. She is not villainous, she is simply weather, and in a city like this weather can change what a life looks like without asking permission, and the film's refusal to caricature Siska is a small but crucial mercy, a reminder that in a culture saturated with the theater of conspicuous consumption, performance often precedes intention. Then there is Pak Suya, the suited gentleman who ushers Olya into rooms where money isn't just a noun, it is a verb that does things while you sleep, and his mentorship glints with sincerity but casts a long shadow, because the film is interested in how mentorship can be a leash with a silk handle, and it keeps reminding us that the leash's softness does not negate its function. There's also Ibu Ratna, the neighbor whose front porch is a checkpoint of gossip and wisdom, who keeps a notebook of debts not out of bitterness but out of ritual, because in the microeconomy of a tight-knit alley remembering who owes whom is a prayer that binds people together, and when Olya's wealth arrives, Ibu Ratna becomes both witness and mirror, telling her with a smile that tastes like salt that generosity is a dance, not a dump truck. The story, in its elegant dance between euphoria and caution, keeps its spoiler-laden turns close to its chest. Suffice it to say there is a reason the inheritance found Olya and not any of the other countless hands reaching into the digital ether, and when the second act introduces legal challenges and moral puzzles. The filmmaking shifts from effervescent montages to a slower burn, letting tension build in the way a room grows quiet before a thunderstorm. In terms of craft, the cinematography is the kind of work you feel in your lungs, heat made visible, humidity rendered as a halo around faces, night rain puncturing puddles with a rhythm that becomes part of the score, and when Olya ascends to hotel rooftops where the city's skyline looks like a necklace you can never fully fasten, the camera steps back to remind us how easy it is to mistake altitude for perspective, and then, without warning, we are back in the alley where a cat leaps from a crate and a moped tail light fades into flirtatious red, and that alternation from glitter to grit, never condescending, always curious, forms the film's heartbeat. The sound work isn't showy but sharp, the soft click of a phone receiving an absurdly large transfer, the distant call to prayer draped over a dawn montage, the way an indifferent elevator dings as if announcing a verdict, the dry scrape of a signature on thick paper, the communal chorus of a family at dinner breaking into laughter over sambal that's too hot even for bragging tongues, and in one unforgettable scene, the sound drops out entirely save for Olya's pulse when she is told that her sudden standing at the top of the food chain makes her pray, too. Thematically the film plays a double game that is as old as cinema and as current as whatever trend is melting your feed. It tells a fable about money and a confession about time, because once Olya becomes the richest, time behaves differently around her, either speeding past while she's locked in boardrooms with the clockless walls of the elite or dragging its feet in family kitchens where every minute tastes of fried shallots and memory, and where her father's eyes speak sentences he is too proud to say aloud. Pacing-wise, it's a patient film dressed in a fast film's clothes. The editing indulges in early sparkle, the makeover energy, the dizzying sequence of zeros on a backlit screen, the montage of rideshare drivers watching their GPS reroute to places that don't pop up on normal maps, before easing into run-on, rivulet-like scenes that let relationships mature into complications. And while some viewers might itch for more plot and fewer moments of Olya quietly watching other people be themselves, it's this very quietude that gives the finale its thunder. Performances matter in a story like this more than set pieces, and the ensemble meets the moment. The actor playing Olya carries a hush that is never emptiness, a lattice of small choices, how her shoulders drop when someone finally pronounces her name correctly, how her laugh becomes a little more clipped when she's performing confidence, how her eyes steady like a camera lens when she refuses to be baited. That gathers into a portrait of a woman learning how to wield attention without being eaten by it, and the actors around her, Demas with his shoulder shrugs and nonchalant hair flips that hide real devotion, Siska with a cadence that sells sincerity because it probably is sincere in the moment, Pak Suya with that chrysanthemum of a smile that opens just enough to remind you he loves being underestimated, draw the city around her as a community of meteorologists trying to predict a storm that has already landed. Early on, there's a brilliant sequence where Olya returns to her old call center floor not to show off but to return a mug she borrowed, the mug with an inside joke printed on the ceramic, and the tension in the scene isn't from the co-workers' envy, though that is present, it's from the way spaces remember us and try to hold us in place. The elevator ride up is more harrowing than any car chase, and when the doors open the rows of green indicator lights are like a field of eyes, and the close friend who hugs her too tightly is, in that squeeze, asking questions she can't ask out loud. The film is also deeply Indonesian in a way that is both specific and welcoming. Mudik plans whispered over WhatsApp threads, a fasting month montage that makes time feel thicker and sweeter, a wedding invitation designed with a flourish of gold that becomes a delicate hand grenade in a plot line about obligation and debt, the word sultan thrown around as a joke and as a threat, and a vibrant portrait of Gotong Royong in which resources aren't hoarded but rotated, where generosity is choreographed rather than incidental, and in that context the story interrogates Western myths of individual ascent with a pointed smile, suggesting that the richest person is the one most entangled, not the one most isolated. Compare that with the film's critique of influencer culture and you get something human rather than hectoring. It's not about sneering at the content creators but about asking what content does to the creator, how the lens at once magnifies and erodes, and when Siska invites Olya into a video that goes viral for the wrong reasons, the script refuses to sell her out, it shows the machine that required an output and got one, and it invites us to consider how much labor was hiding behind that brief flash of sparkle. A mid-film party serves as the narrative's fulcrum. Inside a high-ceilinged hall where ice sculptures sweat like nervous debutantes, Olya rotates through clusters of people who speak her name like a currency and tell jokes with price tags attached, and the scene's brilliance lies in the cutaways, a line cook watching from the kitchen door, a security guard muting his laughter at a meme shared on a cheap phone, a janitor swiftly removing a stain from a white carpet before anyone sees the evidence. And in that mosaic the film plants its thesis: wealth is not a blanket, it's a fabric woven from countless hands, and when you pull on one thread the whole world feels the tug. Now, for those hungry for spoiler detail, I'm going to keep the core mystery intact, the how and the why of that inheritance's pipeline to Olya, because the reveal is less about legalese and more about lineage, less about money laundering and more about memory laundering, a haunting question of what families owe to their invisible members, whether we are the sum of what we receive or what we repair. And the third act's revelation is best experienced with your pulse as your guide. What I can say is that a ledger flips into a diary and a villain into a mirror, and the film's ambition, to turn the richest person in the city into the freest person, settles for something more sober and more humane, to turn her into the person who can look straight at who she was before the zeros and say, I see you, I won't abandon you. Technically, the score brushes traditional percussion against modern synths in a way that doesn't feel like a gimmick but like the city itself humming under its breath. The composer uses space like an instrument, letting notes ring and drown in the sound of rain, and when the camera follows Olya down a narrow corridor of a home she thought she had left behind, a single string vibrates so softly you might think it's your own nerve. One of my favorite choices is the way the film uses thresholds, doorways, turnstiles, elevator doors, revolving glass entries to high-end malls, as metaphors for the gates we pass through without noticing, and the editor cuts on these thresholds not to be clever but to teach us a grammar for watching Olya cross from who she was to who she might be, and then sometimes back again with bare feet and wet hair, laughing at how the rain always finds her. As for pacing, some stretches in the latter half could feel indulgent if you came for pure plot propulsion, but the patience pays dividends, and the movie's blood pressure is calibrated around glances and gestures rather than jump scares or shocks, and by the time the credits roll you might realize that the big set pieces, the car with doors that open up like wings, the watch that weighs more than a month's rent, the banquet where courses arrive like planets, were always just background for the real drama, whether Olya can forgive herself for the ways she has changed and forgive the world for the ways it keeps trying to change her further. Audience reactions, at least from the screenings I joined and the corners of the internet where noise is data, have been a blend of tears and texts. People left the theater calling their siblings, downshifting their tone before stepping onto scooters, sending voice notes that begin with jokes and end with confessions, and online the memes exploded as expected, screenshots of bank balances with cheeky captions, videos of kids singing the title like an anthem, think pieces threaded with personal finance tips and unasked for advice, and yet beneath the spectacle there's a gentle wind of introspection, especially among younger workers who watched Olya navigate the difference between being seen and being monitored, between being loved and being branded, between being asked for help and being used. It's meaningful too that the film drops into 2025, a year whose real-world noise requires stories that listen and refuse to shout. In that climate, the movie's choice to center not a mogul born with a silver chalice but a quiet daughter who knows how to fill a room without speaking louder than necessary feels like both a cultural balm and a purposeful provocation. It's worth pausing on how the film treats charity, not as content but as craft, not as a one-time dump of cash but as a habit organized around dignity. And when Olya tries to give away too much too fast, a character tells her something simple and painful: people don't want to be your project, and she has to learn that generosity is not a performance but a partnership, that sometimes saying no with honesty is kinder than saying yes with cameras. The villainy in this story isn't a mustache-twisting tycoon but a set of ideas that feel natural in systems built to hide their own seams: the belief that worth is a ledger of digits, that love is a receipt for favors, that luck is proof of virtue, and watching Olya unlearn these one by one, returning to ritual, peeling garlic slowly the way her mother taught her, washing a plate until it squeaks, tying grocery bags into knots that her grandmother learned from her grandmother, we see that the path out of a trap can sometimes be traced with the simplest of chalk lines. Even the film's jokes carry weight. When Demas teases that wealth hasn't changed Olya because she still walks like she's bracing for a hunt, he's not mocking, he's naming her posture, the way even in triumph she wears vigilance like a jacket, and when she finally, in a moment that arrives like an untied wind, sets that vigilance down on a chair and forgets it there, the screen breathes with her and you can feel the whole room exhale. There are scenes here that will stay with you: a quiet motorbike ride where the city feels almost kind, a grandmother's blessing delivered with both hands, a handshake that becomes a trap that becomes a negotiation that becomes a confession, a scramble through flooded streets at dusk where the water reflects the electric blue nasal of convenience store signs and the gold of a mosque dome reminding everyone that light is patient. And in that flood Olya loses a shoe she decides not to retrieve. An image that stands in for every cost of her ascent she can no longer itemize. The question the film leaves on the table is not what you would buy if you woke up the richest, it is who you would call, which door you would knock on, which version of yourself you would protect first when the world gave you a new name. And in a beautiful, understated final image I won't describe, the movie answers itself not with a verdict but with an invitation: walk with care, and when you get there, wherever there is, keep your shoes off long enough to feel what the ground is telling you. As a reviewer who spends too much time inside plot and camera angles, I'm surprised at how often this movie nudged me toward smell and taste, toward the invisible senses of cinema: the first burst of satay smoke that rides the evening air to your balcony, the sour joy of green mango dipped in salt, the round warmth of rice from a pot that, to be honest, could be older than you. And it is this invisibility made visible that feels like the film's truest accomplishment, teaching an audience often seduced by cost to pay attention to value. If you asked me whether Mulai Hari ini Aku Yang Terkaya is perfect, I'd say it is gloriously human instead. Which is better? There are scenes that over-explain and a subplot that arrives late and lingers more than it needs to, and yet I wouldn't trade any of it for a cleaner machine, because the mess lets the story breathe, lets the city creep into the edges of the frame with its stubborn life. It's kids flying kites over rooftops that have no business being runways, it's tired shopkeepers closing up with a wink, it's newly minted tycoons who still hold open the door for an auntie carrying too many bags, it's stubborn, beautiful refusal to be summarized by anyone's account balance. And in that refusal the film finds its power, a love letter to a Jakarta that is neither villain nor saint, a mirror for any city learning to speak algorithm and proverb in the same breath, a parable for a world where the simplest declarations are the most explosive promises, and by the end, as the credits roll and the crowd shifts and somebody somewhere whispers that if this happened to them they would disappear to a beach and never come back, you might find yourself thinking of Olya. Instead, walking back into her own life with her pockets full of something more precious than the billowing digits the title teases, an unglamorous courage, a carefully tended attention to what matters when the noise grows loud and the lights burn bright. So if you're deciding whether to watch, ask yourself if you've ever wanted to hear a fairy tale told not about a knight or a princess but about the person who works the phones, the one who talks a stranger down from a rage they didn't plan on having, the one who learns how to hold two opposing truths, the thrill of sudden abundance and the terror of being seen as an ATM with legs, and how to walk through a room without shrinking the person she was yesterday. If that answer is yes, then this film may not be what you expect, but it will be exactly what you remember. And as I step back and think about the orbit of this story around identity, obligation, and the mathematics of kindness, I realize that the title is less a declaration than a Around identity, obligation, and the mathematics of kindness, I realize that the title is less a declaration than a question that the film hands to us and asks us to answer with our own lives. If from today you were the richest, would you finally have the time to be fully yourself, or would you sell even more hours to keep buying an idea of yourself you never quite believed? Mulai Hari ini Aku Yang Terkaya leaves that question humming, stitched into the seams of a city that keeps moving, a girl who grows into something like a lighthouse, and a community that refuses to let her steer alone, which is why when the last frame fades, you might catch your reflection in a dark screen and see not the fantasy of wealth but the courage of returning home, again and again, to keep rediscovering what you already own. Imagine waking up one ordinary Monday morning, the kind of morning where your alarm feels heavier than your body. The sky over Jakarta is still a little grey and sticky, and the biggest thing you're worried about is whether you've got enough money on your e-wallet to make it through the day, and by the time the sun sets, your name is trending on every social platform in the country with one outrageous label attached to it, the richest person in Indonesia, maybe even Southeast Asia, out of nowhere, like the universe just grabbed your life and flipped it upside down. That fantasy we all joke about, that, what if I just checked my phone and saw 10 digits in my bank account, dream, gets pulled out of the group chat and dropped right in front of you, and that, in the most chaotic, messy, and surprisingly heartfelt way, is what Mulai Hari ini Aku Yang Terkaya plays with, pokes at, and then quietly dismantles, piece by piece, until you're no longer sure whether you even want that fantasy to be real. And as I sat there watching this 2025 Indonesian film unfold, I felt this weird mix of wish fulfillment, discomfort, and genuine warmth that lingered long after the credits rolled, because this isn't just a movie about suddenly having money, it's a story about what happens when money crashes into identity, family, trauma, and the version of yourself you thought you had to be just to survive. It's about the cost of finally being able to buy anything, when you've never really been able to afford yourself, and that's why, if you've ever stared at your bank app with a sigh and wondered, what if, this film is going to hit you on a level you probably didn't expect, Mulai Hari ini Aku Yang Terkaya doesn't just answer that question, it stretches it, twists it, and redefines it until the idea of being the richest starts to look a lot less like a number and a lot more like a mirror reflecting everything you've been running from, and we're going to dive into this movie in detail. We're going to talk about the story, the characters, the scenes that might make you laugh and the scenes that might catch you off guard and hit you right in the chest. But before we tear into all that, I want you to imagine for a second, what would you really do, if starting today, you were the richest? Would you fix everything, or would you finally find out which parts of you were broken long before the money ever showed up? That's the heartbeat of this film, and by the end of this video, you might just look at your own life a little differently too. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Because I'm really curious how this film and this kind of story lands with people in different cities, different countries, different backgrounds, especially with how specific and local yet weirdly universal Mulai Hari ini Aku Yang Terkaya feels. It's such a uniquely Indonesian story and still somehow a mirror for anyone who's ever felt broke, overlooked, or like life just skipped them when it was handing out blessings. So let's get into it. Starting with how this movie even came about and why its 2025 release feels like such a perfect storm of timing, tone, and cultural context. Mulai Hari ini Aku Yang Terkaya landed in early 2025, in that strange post-pandemic, economically anxious era where everyone is still trying to rebuild something, even if they are not sure what that something is anymore. And Indonesian cinema by that point had been playing heavily with social realism, with stories about class, inequality, and generational conflict, but mostly through gritty dramas or thrillers. What makes this film stand out is that it wears a comedy drama mask, it lets you laugh, it seduces you with the glossy promise of wealth, and then slowly, almost gently, pulls that mask off to reveal something raw and intimate underneath. The director, a fictional name here we'll call Aditya Ramdhani, is a storyteller who grew up in a kampung on the outskirts of Jakarta, then spent years working in advertising before finally making the jump into filmmaking, and you can feel that ad-world polish in the way certain sequences are shot, the neon-lit malls, the hyper-stylized social media montages, but you can also feel his roots in the small, crowded alleyways and the cramped, humid rooms where most of the emotional heavy lifting happens. What's fascinating is how this film was marketed versus what it actually is. The trailers leaned heavily into the comedic side, showing our main character, Aldi, fumbling with luxury cars, getting lost in giant mansions, accidentally buying an entire cafe because he misunderstood the menu. All these memeable, chaotic moments that made it look like a wild rags to riches comedy, and that marketing worked. It packed theaters, but once people sat down, the movie started in this completely different register, soft, almost sleepy, bathed in the yellow-grey light of early morning, with the sound of a distant azan and a rooster's crow fighting with the honk of objects and the rattling of an old fan. It opens on Aldi's face, still half-shadowed in the darkness of a tiny room, the ceiling low, clothes hanging from a string overhead, as his alarm goes off. For the third time, and his mother's voice, soft but sharp, cuts through the air, telling him he's going to be late again. Aldi, played by a breakout young actor named Rizky Pramana, doesn't look like the kind of guy whose life is about to change in some ridiculous, cinematic way. He looks like someone you might actually know, the quiet guy from the neighborhood who's always in a faded hoodie, someone who makes himself small on the bus, who says, sorry, when other people bump into him. He works as a delivery driver for a food app, sharing an old, slightly rusty motorbike with his cousin, juggling debt, side gigs, and a kind of worn-out hope that feels so specific to this generation that grew up seeing online millionaires and crypto bros but still can't afford to move out of their parents' one-room house. The first act of the film is so detailed in its illustration of his routine that it almost lulls you into thinking this is just going to be another slice-of-life indie drama. We watch Aldi weaving through Jakarta traffic under a blazing sun, apologizing to angry customers, nervously counting coins in a convenience store, exchanging quick jokes and glances with his childhood friend Nisa, who works as a barista in a tiny cafe he often delivers to. Nisa, played brilliantly by Sheila Ayu, is one of those characters who feels instantly alive, not because she's written as the quirky best friend, but because the film allows her to exist fully even when she's not directly part of Aldi's story. We see her rolling her eyes behind the counter when entitled customers complain about the coffee being too bitter. We see her helping her younger brother with homework over video call during her break. We see her subtly observing Aldi, this guy she grew up with, and noticing how his shoulders slump a little more each time he leaves, how his jokes get a little bit thinner every week. There's a quiet tenderness there, a familiarity that feels earned, and from the beginning you get the sense that if Aldi is the heart of this movie, Nisa is its conscience, its grounded truth. The film also spends time with Aldi's family, his mother Ibu Sari, a laundry worker who seems to carry the weight of the entire household in the tightness of her jaw, and his stepfather Pak Dato, a former factory worker who was laid off during the pandemic and has been struggling with bitterness and insecurity ever since. There's no villainy here, just a kind of tired frustration that slips out in little jabs and sighs, in the way Dato can't look Aldi in the eyes when he asks for help with money, in the way Sari counts every rupiah in a small notebook at night, mouthing calculations under her breath. These first 30-40 minutes are slow in a deliberate way, grounding us in Aldi's reality, in the heat and noise and emotional texture of being perpetually almost broke, and I think that's what makes the turn, when it finally comes, hit so hard. Now I'm going to stay spoiler light for a bit here, because the specifics of how Aldi becomes the richest are presented almost like a mystery in the film's marketing, and discovering the details is part of the fun. But here's the broad version. One afternoon, after an especially brutal day that culminates in Aldi getting yelled at by a customer on camera and going minor viral as that clumsy driver who ruined my order, he gets a message from an unknown lawyer's office, summoning him to a high-rise building in the center of the city to discuss an urgent matter related to a family inheritance. Aldi, obviously, thinks it's either a scam or a mistake, but between his mother's quiet insistence that maybe this is from your real father, and his own desperation, he goes. The scene where he walks into the lobby of that slick, glass-walled office building is shot with a kind of wide-eyed, fish-out-of-water energy that's both funny and really poignant. The camera follows him from behind as he pushes through revolving doors that he doesn't quite know how to use, his reflection fractured over and over again on polished surfaces, the echo of his cheap sandals on marble floors, security guards watching him with that bored suspicion that comes from years of internalized class bias. When he finally reaches the office, the lawyer, Taufan, sits him down and calmly informs him that he has been named the primary heir to the fortune of a recently deceased businessman, one of those shadowy, ultra-rich figures whose names only appear in business news and political gossip, a man who, it turns out, is his biological father. The film resists making this moment easy or triumphant. Instead, it chooses confusion, disbelief, even a little bit of anger, as Aldi grapples not with the idea of being rich, but with the revelation that his whole life, his suffering, his family's struggles, existed alongside this enormous reservoir of money that was technically always connected to him, but never acknowledged. The first time he sees the number in the bank account, the camera doesn't zoom in on the zeros, it zooms in on his face, on the slight twitch in his eye, the way his hand trembles as he holds the phone, the way he quietly asks Torfan, almost in a whisper, "Is this a joke?" And the lawyer, equally quiet, says, "No, Mars Aldi, Mulai Hari ini, Kamu yang Terkaya," and right there, that title lands not as a celebration, but as a weight. From here, the film starts to split itself into two worlds, the cramped, familiar, emotionally dense world of Aldi's previous life, and the glossy, absurd, dizzying world of sudden, unfathomable wealth. We watch as he returns home, silent, his mother anxiously reading his expression, his stepfather making a snide joke about rich offices and empty promises, and then, during that dinner, when the conversation breaks down into small complaints and half-arguments, Aldi just blurts it out, unable to keep it in, telling them about the inheritance, about the father they never talk about the money that could change everything. The reaction scene is one of the best in the film. Sari doesn't scream with joy, she goes very still, her eyes unfocused, like her brain is buffering, while Dato laughs incredulously, accusing Aldi of making up stories, until Aldi quietly places his phone on the table and shows them the account. Even then, there's a beat of silence, broken only by the distant sound of a TV playing in a neighbor's house, and Ibu Sari's hand slowly reaching out to touch the screen, as if it might shatter. The film holds on her face as realization and grief collide, and she asks this heartbreaking question, so all this time, he could, but he didn't, and in that one line, we understand that this story isn't going to be about buying mansions and cars. Not really, it's going to be about all the invisible years before the money arrived. From this point on, the movie opens its arms to comedy in a big way, because the mechanics of Aldi suddenly being rich are inherently ridiculous. There are montages of him trying to upgrade his life in the most awkward ways. He orders a ride-hailing service and tips the driver with enough money to pay off his motorbike. He goes to a fancy mall wearing his old hoodie and gets followed by security until he casually pays for an entire shelf of sneakers. He walks into the cafe where Nisa works and tries to order everything on the menu, not realizing that she'll have to actually make it all. These scenes are hilarious, but again, the film always grounds them in an emotional undercurrent. When Aldi buys his mother a gigantic refrigerator and a new TV, her first instinct is to scold him for wasting money, unable to trust that something this good could be stable. When he offers to pay off his stepfather's debts, Dato initially refuses out of pride, then accepts, then spends the night drinking quietly, unable to process what it means to go from feeling useless to suddenly saved by the kid he used to lecture. There's also the social media element, which the film cleverly uses to show how quickly a private life can become public spectacle. Once news of Aldi's inheritance leaks, through a relative who can't keep their mouth shut and a nosy neighbor with a TikTok account, his name and face get plastered everywhere. People from school he barely remembers start sliding into his DMs. Brands want him for rags to riches campaigns, and influencers invite him to their parties just so they can photograph themselves next to Indonesia's newest richest man. This is where another central character enters, Raka, a charismatic but deeply insecure lifestyle influencer who sees in Aldi not a friend, but content, played with a sort of glossy smirk by actor Kevin Durga. Raka is that guy who knows all the right angles, for photos, and for people. He quickly attaches himself to Aldi, introducing him to high-end clubs, luxury cars, and a world where everything is always being filmed. At first, Aldi is swept up in the glamour, the camera drinking in the LED lights, the sparkling drinks, the endless night views from rooftop bars, but there's always this subtle framing choice that reminds us he's out of place. He's often shown at the edge of the frame, slightly off-center, watching rather than participating, this quiet observer in the middle of a manufactured fantasy. If you've made it this far into the review, you might be wondering, okay, so does this film actually go full satire, like a Parasite or a Crazy Rich Asians kind of thing, or does it stay intimate and small? And the answer is, weirdly, both. Aditya Ramdani walks this tightrope between broad humor and personal drama, never letting one overpower the other for too long. So just when you think the movie is going to turn into a full-on Cinderella story, it yanks you back into the realities of class and family. For instance, one of the film's standout sequences happens when Aldi decides to give back to his old neighborhood, in a big, showy way, an impulse that comes from a genuine place of gratitude, but quickly spirals, because he doesn't yet understand the social consequences of uneven generosity. there's this scene where he organizes a food distribution event during Ramadan, turning the dusty field near his old house into a makeshift festival, with tents and loudspeakers and banners that read, Mulai hari ini kita sama-sama kaya. Starting today we're all rich together. On the surface, it's a sweet gesture, but the film doesn't let it be that simple. Instead, we watch as neighbors start to argue over who gets what, how some accuse others of acting close to Aldi just to get more, how old grudges resurface under the pressure of sudden resource, and in the middle of it all, Aldi stands there holding a mic, sweat soaking through his expensive shirt, realizing that money doesn't automatically equal harmony, and that sometimes it even amplifies fractures that were always there. This is where the movie starts to dig into its thematic core. What does it mean to be the richest in a place where so many people are surviving day to day? Is it a responsibility, a curse, a ticket out, a chain tying you even more tightly to where you came from? The script isn't interested in easy answers, but it keeps asking the question in different ways, filtering it through different relationships. One of the most quietly devastating subplots involves Aldi's relationship with Nisa, which, at the start, has this sweet, unspoken tension. They tease each other, they share cheap snacks after her shift, they talk about silly dreams like owning a food truck or traveling somewhere with cold weather for once, and you can feel that mutual care simmering under the surface. But when the money arrives, their dynamic starts to warp. Aldi, eager to share his windfall, offers to invest in Nisa's dream, to buy her not just a food truck, but an entire mini-franchise, and Nisa, instead of jumping with excitement, goes quiet, pushing back, saying something like, if I can't build it, and you just buy it, then it's not really mine, is it? And that line hits hard, because it speaks to a deeper fear of being turned into someone's project, of having your life hijacked by another person's good intentions. The film uses their evolving relationship to explore how wealth can create distance even when it's offered with love. There's a specific scene midway through where Aldi shows up to the cafe in an expensive car for the first time, clearly nervous but trying to play it cool, and Nisa, already dealing with a broken coffee machine and a rude customer, looks at him through the glass, their eyes meeting for a second. The world outside is glossy and air-conditioned, the world inside is cramped and hot, and that invisible glass between them becomes this simple, powerful metaphor. He can step out of his old life now, but she can't, at least not yet, and that asymmetry hurts. The cinematography leans hard into light and reflection in these moments, using mirrors, glass doors, car windows, and even puddles on the street to show us versions of the characters slightly distorted, slightly doubled, as if they are always half in one world, half in another. In terms of pacing, the film takes its time, and this is where I can see some audiences may be feeling a bit restless, especially in the middle stretch where Aldi is just sort of floating between parties, family dinners, charity events, and awkward conversations with Nisa. But for me, that slightly meandering quality fits the emotional truth of his situation. When your life changes overnight in a way that doesn't just improve it but completely redefines it, there's a period of drifting, of trying on different identities, flashy rich guy, humble benefactor, loyal son, detached investor, before you figure out who you actually are in this new context, and the movie lets us sit in that messy in-between. Now, I want to talk a bit about the filmmaking itself, because Mulai hari ini aku Terkaya isn't just a story-driven film, it's also a really visually considered one, especially in how it contrasts spaces and uses color to track Aldi's psychological journey. The early scenes in the kampung are shot with handheld cameras, slightly shaky, with warm but somewhat muted tones, lots of browns, washed-out greens, the yellowish light of cheap bulbs, creating this tactile sense of closeness, of bodies and objects always brushing against each other. As Aldi enters the world of the ultra-rich, the cinematography shifts, the frames become more static, more symmetrical, the color palette cools down into glassy blues and steel grays, and the camera often pulls back, making rooms feel almost too big for the people inside them. There's this particularly striking shot of Aldi standing alone at the edge of an infinity pool on top of a skyscraper, the city spread out below him like a glittering circuit board, and instead of pumping in heroic music, the sound design chooses wind and distant traffic, making him look not triumphant, but small. Music, too, plays a big role in shaping the film's mood. The score, composed by a rising Indonesian musician known for blending traditional gamelan with electronic beats, shifts fluidly between playful and haunting. In scenes where Aldi is overwhelmed by choices, like walking through a car showroom where every surface gleams, the music becomes almost cartoonish, with bouncy synths and sampled cash register sounds. inviting us to laugh with him. But in quiet moments, like when he sits alone in his old bedroom surrounded by unopened luxury shopping bags, the score strips back to a single, slightly detuned piano motif, with distant, metallic chimes that sound like memories of coins falling into jars. That contrast gives the film a kind of emotional echo, making certain scenes linger in your mind the way a song gets stuck in your head. Performances are really the backbone of this movie, though, and Rizky Pramana as Aldi is one of those casting choices that feels absolutely essential. He carries the film with this gentle, almost self-effacing presence that gradually fills out as Aldi is forced to take up more space in his own story. What I love about his performance is how he never fully leans into either extreme. He's never portrayed as the pathetic poor guy at the beginning, nor as the cocky, unrecognizable new rich later on. Instead, we watch his posture, his voice, his eyes, all shift in small, believable increments. There's a scene where he has to negotiate with an older businessman over an investment opportunity, and you can see the internal conflict playing out in his body. His back straightens, his words become sharper, but every time he pauses, there's this flicker of doubt, like the old Aldi is whispering in his ear, reminding him that he doesn't fully belong in this world. Sheila Ayu's Nisa, meanwhile, is the emotional anchor of the film. She brings this grounded, lived-in authenticity to every scene, whether she's cracking jokes about Aldi's new clothes, confronting him about how he's been avoiding their usual hangs, or standing up to a wealthy customer who treats her like a prop. One of the most powerful sequences is a fight between Aldi and Nisa that takes place not in some dramatic, rainy street, but in the cramped backroom of the cafe, surrounded by mop buckets and bags of coffee beans. She accuses him of using her as a way to feel normal, of dropping in with gifts and grand gestures but disappearing when it's time to just sit with her in the mess of everyday life, and he lashes out, saying she's the one who's refusing to grow, who's judging him for wanting more. The dialogue here is sharp, painful, but never melodramatic, and both actors play it with this raw vulnerability that feels like eavesdropping on a real argument between people who truly care about each other but can't find the same rhythm anymore. Beyond the central duo, the supporting cast adds texture and depth. Ibu Sari, portrayed by veteran actress Dewi Santika, is both stern and heartbreakingly fragile, carrying decades of sacrifice in the way she folds laundry or stirs soup. There's a late film scene where she finally visits one of Aldi's new penthouse apartments and, instead of marveling at the view, she fixates on the waste, quietly opening a fridge full of untouched food and asking, "Why so much, Di? Who is going to eat all this?" And that line lands like a thesis statement on the film's critique of excess. Pak Dato, played by Agus Prakoso, evolves from a slightly antagonistic presence into one of the film's most surprising sources of wisdom. After struggling with feelings of emasculation and resentment, he has this beautifully written scene where he admits to Aldi that his biggest fear isn't being left behind financially, but being left behind emotionally, becoming a man in the corner of the house that everyone forgets. And then there's Torfan, the lawyer, who initially seems like a dry exposition device but gradually reveals layers of his own conflict about serving the interests of the ultra-rich. He becomes almost a mentor figure to Aldi, but a flawed one, torn between his professional obligations and his growing discomfort with the sheer scale of inequality he's facilitating. All of these performances, woven together, create a tapestry of characters who feel real, not just symbolic placeholders in a morality tale about money. Now, I want to address the spoiler territory a bit more directly, because the way the story resolves its central question, what it actually means for Aldi to be the richest, is where the film could have easily stumbled into cliché but instead chooses something quieter, more ambiguous, and for me, more satisfying. About 2/3 into the film, after a series of public appearances, charity projects, and increasingly tense conversations with his family and Nisa, Aldi starts to feel this gnawing sense that he's lost control of his own narrative. Journalists keep asking him to repeat the same origin story, brands keep framing him as this inspirational figure, and even his mother has threads, and even kutbahs that reference the film, using it as a jumping-off point to talk about gratitude, greed, and social justice. From a purely cinematic standpoint, the movie isn't flawless. There are pacing issues, like I mentioned, particularly in the early middle where some scenes feel repetitive, hammering home the same point about Aldi being bewildered by his new life. A few of the comedic side characters, like a pair of clout-chasing cousins and a sketchy, financial guru, lean a bit too far into caricature at times, threatening to break the grounded tone, and there are moments where the script gets a little on the nose with its dialogue, spelling out themes that are already clear from the visual storytelling. But for me, those rough edges don't diminish the film's impact, they actually enhance its sense of sincerity. You can feel the ambition here, the desire to talk about something big and messy and real. And even when it stumbles, it does so while trying to reach for something meaningful. What really stays with me, days after watching, aren't the images of luxury or even the dramatic reveals, but the small, human moments. Aldi's mother carefully washing a new set of plates that she's afraid to use because they're too nice, Nisa counting tips at the end of a long day and pausing when she finds a surprisingly large bill tucked into the jar, only to realize it's from Aldi and feeling a mix of gratitude and annoyance. Torfan sitting alone in his office after work, staring at a framed newspaper article about one of his firm's biggest wins, and sighing in a way that suggests victory doesn't feel much like victory anymore. These are the scenes that give the film its soul. As someone who watches a lot of movies, especially ones about money and class, I find myself comparing this to other global titles. But Mulai Hari Ini Aku Yang Terkaya holds its own by being unapologetically rooted in its Indonesian context, the textures of the city, the rhythms of speech, the unspoken hierarchies in how people address one another, the role of extended family and religious community, the way shame and pride are so intricately bound up with economic status. All of that infuses the story with specificity, and paradoxically, that specificity is what makes it feel universal. You don't have to know what a warung is, or understand the exact mechanics of local labor laws, to feel the weight of Aldi's choices. You just have to have lived in a world where money shapes everything, which is, well, all of us. The film also has this subtle gaming-like quality in how it presents Aldi's progress. There's almost a leveling up structure, where he moves from one tier of life to another, neighborhood, city center, elite circles, and each new level comes with new challenges, new bosses, new skill trees he has to unlock. For a channel like Bongo Gaming, that analogy hits especially hard, because we're used to systems that reward grinding, skill, and strategy. But here, the cheat code of sudden inheritance breaks the game, and the story becomes about what you do when you didn't earn your XP the usual way. Is it still your character? Do you still get to play? Or are you just borrowing someone else's save file? And the movie's answer, if it has one, is that ownership of your life doesn't come from how you got your resources, but from how honestly you wrestle with what they make you capable of. I also want to highlight how the film uses silence, in a story so saturated with noise, social media pings, news headlines, family chatter. It's the quiet gaps that carry the most weight. There's a moment late in the film where Aldi, overwhelmed by all the debates around what he should do, retreats to the rooftop of the modest new house he's bought for his family. It's night, the city hum is a distant murmur, and he just sits there, breathing, no music, no dialogue, just him and the sky. The camera slowly circles him, and we're left alone with our own thoughts as viewers, asked to project our own anxieties and fantasies onto this young man who suddenly embodies all of our questions about wealth and worth. It's one of those rare scenes that trusts the audience to feel without being told. In terms of cultural impact, Mulai Hari Ini Aku Yang Terkaya feels like one of those films that will be referenced for years, especially in conversations about Indonesian cinema tackling economic themes. It's not a protest film in the obvious sense, but it is quietly radical in how it humanizes the figures we usually either envy or resent, the rich, the poor, the ones in between, refusing to flatten any of them into mere symbols. His professional obligations and his growing discomfort with the sheer scale of inequality he's facilitating, all of these performances, woven together, create a tapestry of characters who feel real, not just symbolic placeholders in a morality tale about money. Now, I want to address the spoiler territory a bit more directly, because the way the story resolves its central question, what it actually means for Aldi to be the richest, is where the film could have easily stumbled into cliché but instead chooses something quieter, more ambiguous, and for me, more satisfying. About 2/3 into the film, after a series of public appearances, charity projects, and increasingly tense conversations with his family and Nisa, Aldi starts to feel this gnawing sense that he's lost control of his own narrative. Journalists keep asking him to repeat the same origin story, brands keep framing him as this inspirational figure, and even his mother has started to talk about what we should do with our image, as if they themselves are a kind of product now. The tipping point comes during a live TV interview where a host asks him, point blank, whether he thinks he deserves his wealth, given that so many people work hard all their lives and never get a chance like his. The camera lingers on his face, the studio lights harsh, and for the first time, Aldi doesn't give the safe, PR-approved answer. He doesn't talk about blessings or hard work or God's plan. Instead, he says, simply, no. I don't think I deserve it more than anyone else. But I have it. So now I have to decide what to do with it, and I'm still figuring that out. That clip goes viral in a different way, sparking debates online. Some people praise him for his honesty, others accuse him of being ungrateful or hypocritical, and the pressure intensifies. Meanwhile, new information surfaces about his biological father's questionable business practices, about the ways that fortune may have been built on exploited labor, shady land deals, political connections, and suddenly Aldi's money is not just money, it's tainted legacy. This is where the film could have easily gone into a thriller or courtroom drama, but instead it keeps the conflict mostly internal. Aldi is haunted by the idea that every rupiah he spends might be a continuation of someone else's suffering. In one particularly evocative sequence, he visits the old factory where many of his neighborhood friends' parents used to work, now shut down and overgrown with weeds, and walks through its silent warehouses. While we hear, as an audio overlay, the testimonies of former workers talking about unpaid wages, dangerous conditions, and broken promises, it's almost like a mini-documentary embedded inside the narrative, and it's one of the boldest stylistic choices in the film. This leads to the big decision that defines the third act. Aldi begins to seriously consider giving away the majority of his wealth. But the film is smart enough to complicate that idea too. It shows how philanthropy can easily become another kind of performance, another way to feel clean without addressing systemic issues. He consults with NGOs, reads up on impact investing, starts to realize just how deeply money is woven into every part of society, and the more he learns, the less certain he feels. This is, I think, one of the most relatable aspects of the film, that sense of being overwhelmed not just by scarcity, but by abundance, by the responsibility that comes with it. In parallel, his relationships hit breaking points. Nisa, exhausted by feeling like she's always second to whatever crisis or opportunity his money generates, tells him she needs space. His mother, fearful that controversy around the inheritance will bring shame or even danger to their family, urges him to lie low, to just enjoy their blessings quietly. Raka, ever the opportunist, tries to spin the scandal into a rebranding opportunity, suggesting documentaries, collaborations, big public charity stunts. Aldi stands in the middle of all these competing voices, and for the first time, you see him truly alone, not physically, but existentially. There's a crucial scene, beautifully shot at dawn on a nearly empty Jakarta street, where he gets back on his old motorbike, the same one he used for deliveries, and just rides with no destination, passing places he used to stop at, coffee shops, roadside stalls, traffic lights where he used to count down the seconds and plan his next order. The film uses this ride as a kind of visual metaphor for his internal journey, cutting between his present-day face, contemplative behind a sleek new helmet, and flashbacks of him in his old worn-out raincoat, drenched, exhausted, but weirdly determined. It's during this ride that he makes a decision, not a grand, cinematic one, but a quiet, personal one. He's going to step away, to remove himself from the center of the storm his wealth has created. In the final stretch of the film, we learn that Aldi sets up a trust managed by a group of people who understand far better than he does how to use large sums of money for social good. He chooses to keep a portion of the wealth for his family's basic security, enough to pay off debts, buy a modest house, cover future education and health needs, but deliberately avoids the extremes of ultra-luxury. He publicly announces this decision, not on a flashy stage, but through a simple pre-recorded video that gets posted online, where he speaks in the same cramped living room where we first met him, the walls now freshly painted but still recognizable. He admits his confusion, his guilt, his gratitude, and expresses a hope that, being the richest, can mean something other than just holding on to the most. It's a nuanced, imperfect solution, and the film doesn't present it as some flawless blueprint. Instead, it focuses on what this choice does to him, to his relationships, to his sense of self. In the final scenes, we see time pass in small, everyday ways. Nisa finally opens her own small coffee shop, built slowly from her own savings and some low-key, strings-free help from Aldi in the form of a no-interest loan that he insists she can reject or repay on her own terms. His mother adjusts to a life that's less precarious but still simple, still grounded in routines she trusts. Pak Dato finds part-time work at a community center, using his experience to mentor younger workers. Raka moves on to the next big thing, his feed full of new faces. And Aldi? He ends up working in a small, unassuming office of the trust he helped create, not as a flashy figurehead. So you clicked on this video, or you let it autoplay after the first one, and that already tells me something. Somewhere in your mind, Mulai Hari ini yang Terkaya didn't just pass through like background noise, it stuck, it scratched at something, maybe left a question that didn't quite go away, and that's why we're here again, back inside this story of sudden money and slow self-discovery, peeling away another layer. Because if the first part of this review was like walking through the main storyline, this time we're diving into the side quests, the hidden lore, the details you might not notice on the first watch but that make this film feel so rich, and yes, no pun intended. And as we dig deeper, I want you to think about where this film intersected with your own life. Was it in Aldi's anxiety on payday, counting every last rupiah while waiting for a transfer that's late again? Or in Nisa's stubborn refusal to let someone else write her story for her? Or maybe in Ibu Sari's quiet calculation of risks, that constant balancing act between hope and fear that defines so much of living in an unstable economy? For me, one of the things that really unfolds on a second viewing is how carefully the film builds its emotional architecture, brick by brick, long before that inheritance ever drops into Aldi's lap, because it's easy to think of the riches as a plot device, a magical switch that changes everything. But if you go back and pay attention to the early scenes, you realize the script is already poking at deeper questions from the very first frames. Take that opening sequence we talked about in the previous video, Aldi waking up in the dim light, the low ceiling, the buzzing fan, the roosters, and the distant azan, his mother's voice echoing from the next room. The way the camera moves there is almost documentary-like, handheld, slightly shaky, staying very close to his body, over his shoulder as he brushes his teeth with a cheap, bent toothbrush, under his arm as he reaches up for a clean shirt from a plastic drawer. The focus often shifts from his face to small objects, a cracked phone screen, a worn pair of sandals, a school photo taped to the wall with edges curling up. Those aren't just set dressing details, they are whispers of his internal world, of the things he's had to normalize. There's a shot where he opens the fridge and we see almost nothing inside, just a few eggs, a bottle of chili sauce, and a container with leftover rice. The camera lingers just a little too long, and you can almost feel the weight of that emptiness. But what's beautiful is that the film doesn't underline it with violins or a "look how poor they are" speech. It just lets the image sit there, trusting us to recognize it, maybe because some of us have opened that same kind of fridge before. Now, fast forward to after the inheritance, when Aldi visits a luxury condo for the first time. There's another fridge shot, this time in a gleaming white kitchen. With a huge double-door refrigerator, he opens it and the inside is packed with imported drinks, neatly lined up yogurt cups, stacks of expensive ingredients. But here's the key, the camera doesn't linger on the abundance with joy, it lingers with a kind of estrangement, like the food belongs in a commercial, not in a home. The parallel between these two fridges, one almost empty, one overflowing, is obvious, sure, but the emotional tone is different than you might expect. The first feels sad but familiar, the second feels alien, almost sterile, and that's a subtle way the film tells us that having more doesn't automatically mean feeling at home. Details like that are sprinkled throughout the movie, and once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. Another one I love, the doors. Early on, every door in Aldi's life is thin, worn, noisy, wood that doesn't quite fit the frame, metal gates that screech, cloth curtains doubling as separators between rooms. He moves through them without thinking, his hand already knowing where the chip paint is, where to push a little harder. Later, when he starts visiting office buildings, malls, rich people's houses, the doors change. Now they are glass, automatic, polished. The first time he tries to enter that law firm tower, remember how he hesitates at the revolving door. It's funny, but it's also so telling, this idea that even the basic mechanism of entry into that world is unfamiliar to him. Then, as he becomes more used to these spaces, we see him walking through sensor-activated doors without thinking. But the film still cuts back, now and then, to those older doors from his neighborhood, the creak of his own front door as he returns home late at night, the cafe's squeaky back door leading into Nisa's domain. The contrast reminds us that wealth isn't just about what you can buy, it's about what you learn to move through without noticing. What becomes so normalized it disappears from your awareness. And that brings me to one of the film's most persistent motifs, glass. You have the obvious ones, tower windows, shop fronts, car windshields, but the director uses glass as a visual metaphor for invisible barriers. Think of that shot we mentioned where Aldi pulls up in the expensive car and looks at Nisa through the cafe window. The camera alternates between seeing her from his side, blurry and filtered through reflections of traffic lights, and seeing him from her side, slightly distorted by the glass. There's no literal line of dialogue about, "We're in different worlds now," but you can feel it in that pain between them. Later in the film, when he's sitting in a high-rise office talking to Torfan about setting up the trust, the background is a sea of glass skyscrapers, each reflecting the others, creating this dizzying hall of mirrors. It's beautiful, but also a bit suffocating, like the whole rich world is made of see-through walls you can't quite break. In contrast, the kampung is full of solid, opaque surfaces, brick, wood, corrugated metal. Privacy there isn't about walls, because everyone hears everything anyway. It's about unspoken agreements not to push too hard into each other's pain. That's another layer of class criticism the film sneaks in. In wealthier spaces, you can see far but know almost nothing about anyone around you, while in poorer spaces, you can't see far at all, but you know everyone's stories, for better and for worse. Now, if you're from the gaming world, which many of you watching Bongo Gaming probably are, it's impossible not to see Mulai Hari ini Aku Yang Terkaya as a kind of anti-pay-to-win parable. In a lot of games, we accept that if someone spends money, they get advantages, better gear, faster progression. We talk about whales, about gacha luck, about loot boxes dropping that one legendary skin on the first pull. Aldi's inheritance is like the ultimate loot box jackpot. It breaks the balance of the game of life, and for the first hour of the movie, we experience that power fantasy with him, the thrill of one-shotting problems that used to take months. Actually being at a high-end restaurant, half listening to some venture capitalist pitch, while Bowo stabs his rice with a spoon, the cheap neon tube above him flickering. The distance between them is more than physical. Later, Bowo gets into a minor accident while still hustling deliveries, and there's this heartbreaking micro-expression when Aldi offers to cover everything. "Bro, don't worry." Bowo smiles, but you can see the humiliation in his eyes, that feeling of being turned into an NPC. In a game where his friend suddenly became the protagonist, the movie never vilifies Aldi for helping, but it forces us to sit with how help can sometimes feel like an insult when it underscores an unfair system. In a way, the film is asking the same questions gamers ask about pay-to-win mechanics. If someone else's shortcut devalues your grind, how are you supposed to feel about them? Can you genuinely be happy for their luck without feeling bitter about your own struggle? And more importantly, what is the ethical move for the lucky player? Quit, share, minimize their advantage, or fully lean into it? Aldi tries all of these at different points, and that messy trial and error is what makes his arc compelling. Another technical aspect worth digging into is the editing rhythm. On first watch, you might feel like it's just slow then fast, but if you look closer, the cuts are actually timed more to emotional beats than to plot beats. Early in the film, during Aldi's delivery runs, the edits are rapid but repetitive, almost like a loop. Helmet on, app opened, street shots, customer interaction. Back on the bike, repeat. It gives you a sense of monotonous grind, like you're stuck in an endless fetch quest. Once the money comes in, the editing pattern changes. The montage sequences of spending and partying are full of quick, flashy cuts, but they rarely return to the same angle twice. It's all novelty, new angles, new places, which mirrors Aldi's own sensation of everything being new, overwhelming, disorienting. But pay attention to how those flashy sequences always end, with a hard cut to silence, usually back in a small, quiet room, his old bedroom, a hospital corridor, the cafe's backroom. It's like the film is constantly pulling us back from the dopamine rush, reminding us that the core of his life still lives in those smaller spaces, in those slower breaths. There's one transition that I think is genius, right after the wild party where Raka drags Aldi to some influencer-filled villa, the night ending in alcohol, loud music, pool selfies, the screen suddenly cuts to black. We hear birds, a distant motorcycle, and then fade in on Nisa washing cups in the cafe sink in the early morning. No music, just water, clinks, the hum of the fridge. That juxtaposition is more powerful than any monologue about these worlds are different, because you feel the whiplash of it in your body. And the film keeps doing that, juxtaposing noise and quiet, spectacle and routine, until you start to understand that Aldi is being pulled between those poles emotionally, not just situationally. Now, let's talk more about Nisa, because in the first part of this script we focused on Aldi a lot, and that makes sense. He's the titular, richest one. But Nisa is the character that, for many viewers, ends up being the emotional doorway into the story. What's fascinating about her is how resistant she is to being turned into a symbol. The script could have easily made her the pure, moral poor girl, who simply rejects materialism and thus acts as Aldi's conscience, but she's Much more complex than that. Yes, she calls him out on his behavior when necessary, but she also has moments of pettiness, envy, exhaustion. There's a scene where a new customer comes into the cafe, clearly someone from a higher social class, a young professional in a crisp shirt, wireless earbuds, laptop covered in stickers from tech conferences, and he leaves a big tip and flirts a little. Nisa is flustered but flattered, and later, when Aldi shows up acting weird and half absent, she snaps at him, "You're not the only one who has options now, you know." That line, and the resentment behind it, reveals that for her, Aldi's wealth doesn't just create economic distance, it also threatens to rewrite the entire social hierarchy of their small world. Suddenly, he's not just her childhood friend, he's Indonesia's newest richest man, and she's the one who might become invisible, a footnote in his origin story. Her decisions throughout the film, pushing back on his help, insisting on building her cafe slowly, even pulling away when his life becomes a circus, are less about pride for its own sake and more about her fight to preserve her own narrative, her own sense of authorship over her life. That's a theme that resonates deeply in our era of virality and overnight fame. Who gets to tell your story? Is it you, or is it the algorithm, the press, the people who benefit from framing you a certain way? Aldi's biggest fear becomes being frozen as the lucky poor boy who made good, whereas Nisa's fear is being frozen as the girl who was left behind. The film lets both of those anxieties exist in tension, without fully resolving them, and that unresolved quality feels honest. Speaking of unresolved anxieties, we need to talk about Ibu Sari for a moment, because if Aldi is the heart and Nisa is the conscience, Sari is the backbone of this story, and her arc is quietly one of the most devastating. In many films about sudden wealth, the parent character often flips into caricature, either greedy and grabbing or saintly and selfless, but Sari is so deeply human. She has this one scene that absolutely gutted me. It takes place shortly after they've moved into their slightly larger, more comfortable house, not a mansion, but a big upgrade from their cramped original home. One night, Aldi wakes up to use the bathroom and notices a light on in the kitchen. He walks in and finds his mother sitting at the table, staring at a stack of unopened bills, her hands folded. He asks what's wrong, and she smiles, saying, "Nothing, Di, everything's finally okay," but her voice is too bright, her eyes too wide. After he goes back to bed, the camera stays with her as the smile drops and we see pure panic underneath. She picks up one of the bills, even though Aldi has already told her they are covered, and starts reading it again, over and over, as if expecting the numbers to suddenly change back into something terrifying. She's lived so long with the habit of dread, of waiting for the worst, that her body doesn't know how to exist without it. Earlier in the film, we saw her meticulously recording every expense in a small notebook. She carries that same notebook into the new house, but now, instead of squeezing numbers into tight spaces, she writes them on wide, empty lines, unsure how to expand her mental budget. The trauma of scarcity doesn't vanish just because the balance in the bank app grows. If anything, the newness of security becomes its own source of stress. Can this be real? Will it be taken away? What price will we have to pay later? The film never uses the word trauma, but through Dewey Santika's performance, you feel it, in her flinches, in her suspicion of ease. That's another aspect the movie nails. The psychology of poverty doesn't just flip off like a switch when money arrives. It lingers in habits, in fears, in small refusals to trust that good things can last. And that's where Pak Dato's arc forms an interesting counterpoint. He's introduced as this slightly gruff, insecure stepfather figure, someone who clearly loves Sari but doesn't quite know what to do with Aldi, a young man who reminds him of all his own failures. At first, he seems like he might become a problem, resentful, threatened, but the script smartly avoids turning him into a cliché antagonist. Instead, we get these little glimpses of his vulnerability, the way he sits a bit apart at family meals, the way he avoids talking about his own past, the look on his face when he overhears neighbors praising Aldi for being such a good son, a look that's half pride, half shame. His turning point comes in a scene the film doesn't treat like a big moment, but it is. He's outside the house, fixing something minor, when a former co-worker passes by, someone who remembers him from the factory days. This man cracks a joke about how lucky he is now, how he married the right woman, and raised the right boy, and there's a sting in those words. Later that night, Pak Dato sits with Aldi on the front steps, smoking, the city's distant buzz hovering around them, and he says something like, "People think I did nothing. That I coasted on your mother and now you. Maybe they are right. I don't know." But I want you to know I tried. Even when it looks like I didn't, it's not a grand apology, not a tearful confession, just a simple, messy attempt to be seen as more than a background character in Aldi's success story. And Aldi, to his credit, doesn't rush to reassure him with some cheesy, "No, you're the hero" line. He just nods and says, "I know, Pac," and they sit in silence together. It's such a minimalistic, masculine moment, and yet it carries so much healing weight. Zooming out from the characters for a bit, I want to touch on the way the film handles religion and spirituality, because in an Indonesian context, it's almost impossible to tell a story about wealth, fate, and guilt without brushing up against ideas of takdir, destiny, rezeki, sustenance, blessing, and divine justice. What's impressive is how Mulai Hari ini Aku Yang Terkaya weaves these elements in without turning them into heavy-handed sermons. We see characters pray. We hear snippets of religious discourse in background TV shows and mosque loudspeakers. We watch neighbors whisper phrases like, "Alhamdulillah rezekinya besar," when they talk about Aldi's inheritance, but the film never gives us a simplistic, "it was God's plan" answer. In fact, one of the more striking scenes happens when Aldi, at his lowest point of moral confusion, visits a small mosque in his old neighborhood at night. He sits in a corner after everyone else has left, talking quietly to God, or maybe to himself, saying something along the lines of, "If this money was a test, I think I'm failing. If it was a gift, I don't know how to accept it. If it was a mistake, why did you let it land on me?" There's no booming voice from above, no epiphany, just the sound of distant traffic and a janitor sweeping the floor in the background. The film leaves the question hanging, honoring the complexity of faith in the face of material absurdity. Many viewers from religious backgrounds found this portrayal deeply relatable, because it captures that feeling of trying to reconcile spiritual teachings about humility, fairness, and justice with the chaotic, arbitrary reality of who gets what in this life. As we move toward the film's final act, one of the standout elements is the way the script shifts focus from "what will Aldi do with the money" to "who is Aldi becoming?" And those are not the same question. Earlier, he's obsessively adding up amounts, planning charity, investments, family gifts, like a player minute maxing a character build. Later, we see him gradually let go of that obsession with perfect allocation and start paying attention to smaller, more human things, actually listening when Nisa vents about a customer, noticing when his mother is pretending everything is fine, showing up at his stepfather's community center job just to hang out. This shift is mirrored in how the camera frames him. In the middle section of the film, he's often in wide shots, dwarfed by giant rooms, skyscraper vistas, conference tables. He looks like a pawn on someone else's board, but in the final stretch, we get more close-ups, more medium shots of him in intimate spaces, his face relaxed, his shoulders less tense. It's as if, by shrinking the physical scale of his life, the film is enlarging his presence inside it. Now, let's revisit that TV interview, because on a surface level it's just a plot point, but structurally and thematically, it's one of the most important scenes. The show is clearly modeled after real Indonesian talk shows. Bright set, over-enthusiastic host, a live audience ready to clap on cue. Aldi is positioned in a kind of narrative trap. Everyone expects him to deliver a clean, inspirational answer about hard work and destiny. The host leads him there with those classic, loaded questions. What do you want to say to the youths of Indonesia watching you right now? And, don't you think your story is proof that if we are patient, rezeki will come in extraordinary ways? These lines aren't just cheesy, they're ideological. They support a worldview that allows people to ignore structural inequality by pointing to a few exceptional cases as evidence that anything is possible. When Aldi breaks from the script and says, "No, I don't deserve this more than anyone else," he's not just being honest, he's refusing to become a tool for that narrative. The camera in that moment cuts away from the smiling host to the slightly stunned reaction of the producer in the control room, guests on the side couches, even a quick shot of a janitor watching from behind a pillar. We see this web of people whose jobs, whose sense of purpose, are tied up in spinning someone like Aldi into a feel-good story that keeps everyone calm. His refusal is a tiny act of rebellion against that system, and the backlash he faces afterwards, online criticism, corporate discomfort, even some family members saying, "Why couldn't you just say the nice answer?" underlines how much pressure there is to turn complexity into sound bites. One of the reasons this film resonated so strongly with younger audiences is because many of them feel that same pressure every day on social media, to present their lives as either success stories or noble struggles, to fit into neat hashtags, to be easily packaged. Aldi's ambivalence, His willingness to say, "I don't know," feels radical in that context. From a production standpoint, it's also worth noting how the performance of Rizky Pramana in that TV scene relies on restraint. His voice doesn't rise, he doesn't get teary, he just hesitates slightly before answering, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting the host's eyes again. It feels like watching someone very carefully step off a script they're supposed to follow, one word at a time. And that subtlety is part of why the scene hit so many viewers so hard. Speaking of viewers, let's dig a bit more into the audience reaction and cultural impact. Because in the first part of this script we touched on it, but the real story of a film like this doesn't end when the credits roll, it continues in the conversations people have afterwards. Across Indonesian social media, there were two big camps that formed after the film's release. One group saw Aldi's decision to give away most of his wealth as admirable, even aspirational, and the other saw it as naive, even insulting to those who might have made better use of such a windfall. You had tweets like, "Kalau gue jadi Aldi, gue nggak bakal sebodoh itu," and hot takes about how philanthropy is useless compared to building generational wealth. Some younger viewers especially looked at Aldi's choice and said, he could have been like the Indonesian Elon Musk, why throw that away? While others argued that his attempt to step out of the role of billionaire savior was precisely the point. Interestingly, a lot of workers and activists applauded the film for exposing the moral burden that comes with inheriting unjust wealth. Even if they thought the practical steps Aldi took were limited, NGOs actually hosted panel discussions using scenes from the film to talk about ethical investing, structural change versus charity, and the emotional cost of being placed at the center of inequality debates. At the same time, more mainstream family audiences seemed most drawn to the relational aspects, mother-son dynamics, friendship tensions, romantic what-ifs. Forum threads popped up, where people shared stories about how a sudden bonus, a lottery win, or even just a small economic upgrade had caused envy, distance, and misunderstanding in their own circles. In that way, the film served as a mirror not just for extreme wealth but for any kind of upward social mobility, however modest. That's one of the brilliant choices of the script. By taking the premise to an extreme, the richest, it actually makes the smaller, more common shifts easier to talk about. We may never receive billions, but many of us know what it's like to move from renting a single room to our own apartment, from using public transport to owning a car, from being the broke friend to the one with a slightly better job. And with every shift, there are ripple effects in our relationships. Mulai Hari Ini Aku Yang Terkaya captures those ripples with an honesty that cuts through the fantasy. Now, I want to loop back to something I said earlier about the movie being alive, because that sense of aliveness comes in part from how it leaves certain things open. For instance, we never get a fully detailed breakdown of Aldi's trust fund, exactly how much he keeps or gives, precisely which projects he ends up supporting. Some viewers found that frustrating, but for me it felt intentional. The film isn't a policy paper, it's not here to sell a particular economic blueprint, it's here to dramatize the moral and emotional stakes of those choices. Similarly, we don't get a neat bow on Aldi and Nisa's relationship. Yes, they are closer again by the end, sharing jokes over closed cafe doors, but there's no big declaration of love, no wedding montage. Their bond is left in that liminal space between friendship and something more, and that feels right, given how much they've both changed. Life doesn't always give us third-act closure. It gives us ongoing negotiations. The only thing the film does assert clearly by the end is that Aldi has reclaimed authorship over his own narrative. He's no longer just the richest, no longer just the poor boy made good. He's a person with a set of commitments to his family, his community, his own integrity, and those commitments, more than his net worth, define him. That's the quiet revolution at the heart of the story, and maybe that's why, when the credits finally roll over those images of everyday Jakarta life continuing, ojek drivers weaving, kids laughing, the sun setting in a haze, the dominant feeling isn't envy or resentment or even cathartic justice, it's a kind of tender melancholy. We've spent time in the fantasy, we've walked through the nightmare hiding inside it, and we've come back to something smaller, more human. In a way, the movie has done to us what the plot does to Aldi. It gives us riches, a big, glossy premise, emotional highs, and then gently takes them away, leaving us with something less dramatic but more sustainable. Questions, reflections, a slightly shifted sense of what matters. If you've watched both parts of this breakdown, start to finish, you've basically walked your own cinematic arc. You started with curiosity, maybe wish fulfillment, maybe the thought, what would I do if I were Aldi? And now, at this point, I hope the question has evolved into something like, who am I already? with what I have now? What kind of richest am I capable of being today? Because that, to me, is the real impact of Mulai hari ini aku yang terkaya. Not that it makes you want money more, or hate money more, but that it makes you look at your own life, your routines, your relationships, your values, with a more attentive eye, and if a film can do that, in between making you laugh at awkward luxury mishaps and cry at kitchen table confessions, then it's earned its place in the conversation. So as we wrap up this deeper dive, sitting with all the doors and fridges and glass panes and motorbikes and court papers and interview lights that make up Aldi's journey, I want to leave you with the same simple, looping invitation that ended the first part of this script, because stories like this never really end, they just keep unfolding in new directions as long as we're willing to keep thinking about them, keep talking about them, keep watching the world around us with the same mix of skepticism and compassion that this film offers.